Okay.
Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you for the opportunity, as always, on a Friday evening to come together and try and understand all the things that are happening in the world that are leading us to the Sunday law. I pray and I ask that you may bless the study, bless each and every one of us in a way that benefits us as we learn about you and learn about the great controversy. I ask that the points made may be understood, may be critiqued, so that we can come to a unified position in our understanding of the message and the movement. I praise you and I thank you always. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, so last week I sent out a few articles in the chat that we have, and so I just want to ask, did anyone have an opportunity to read one of them, two of them, all of them? I'm hoping all of them. Yeah, did anyone have an opportunity to go through those?
Guilty. Forgot.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Sorry.
That's okay.
I didn't forget. I started and didn't finish. Sorry. I started looking at Elder Tess's notes on Neo and Paleo. I did do that.
Okay, so
Sorry.
that'll be helpful. That's okay. So essentially, it was really just solidifying the points that we were making last week. And so if you got that point while we were talking, then great. But it was more so articles to reinforce those points and for you to, and for myself to get an in-depth understanding about what we were saying about the far left and their tendency to, or how they get to places where they sympathize with authoritarian regimes. And so the first of those articles, which was far leftists deny China and the Uyghur oppression, it's just at a broad level, and if you want more details, you can read about it. It just went into how some on the far left and some figures on the far left, like some of the characters we spoke about, Max Blumenthal, denied and questioned the scale of the detention of Uyghur populations in Xinjiang, and doubting the claims that have been made about repression in that region. And it pointed out that articles like the Gray Zone, or publications like the Gray Zone, have previously challenged reports of atrocities that happen in Syria, and they are skeptical and express skepticism about what's going on with the Uyghur population. That article goes into the fact that, and this was a point that we were trying to make, that it's not just the very far left that has this problem. There's other publications, like it cites the LA Progressive, which is another left-wing blog that has also published articles that deny, the persecution in China. So this one was really focused and zoomed in on the Uyghur oppression and the denial that occurs on the far left of what's happening there. And there's a point made in there that notes how left-wing support for authoritarian regimes isn't a new thing. It's not something that we're only seeing recently, but it cites historical examples that where far left support ended up backing regimes like Khmer Rouge and Stalin and etc. Then the next article by Coda Story, so that one was by Genocide Watch. The next one by Coda Story was more along the same lines again, the denialism around Xinjiang and the Uyghur oppression. Then the third one that I sent was by The Atlantic, and pointed out that there are left-wing defenders behind Donald Trump. And that's a really good one to go through. If you don't want to go through all of them, that's a really good one to go through. But it points out how you have people like Max Blumenthal, another person named Glenn Greenwald, who are generally critical of Trump, but end up downplaying at the time Russia's election meddling because, and this is the underlying point, because of their deep aversion to hawkish foreign policy, to interventionism, to empire building. And so you have, through various reasonings, this defense of Russia. A point that's made in there by the author of the article, or this guy named, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Biernat or something like that. He distinguishes the current consensus around Russian meddling, or at the time when that was being investigated, from what happened with America and Iraq, because a lot of people on the far left use George Bush's intervention in Iraq as their basis for critiquing neoconservatism. And we're going to go into what that is today and what led to that, why that was prominent. And he points out that that's different, what America did when they invaded Iraq under false and flawed intelligence, to what occurred with the Russian interfering, because at the time in 2003, there was a lot of political pressure to exaggerate that flawed intelligence, whereas with the Russian interference, there wasn't any such kind. So he points to that as a fundamental difference between the two. And then in another segment of the article, it criticizes these anti-interventionist positions from figures like Blumenthal and Greenwald. And he acknowledges, which I think is where we're building to, is that you can acknowledge the validity of opposing, this idea of American imperialism, but at the same time, the author argues that, at least in the context of this article, you can still defend, or the idea of the notion of defending America as a homeland to be a separate issue. And so Russia's attacks in 2016 were a direct attack on the United States. And so that needs to be seen in that lens, from that perspective, defend America, or for Americans, from that perspective, but you can still critique American empire building. Two things can coexist. And hopefully by the end of today's study, and as we conclude my series of studies next week, we'll see that, and I think that's important for us to see, is that two ideas coming from seemingly opposing platforms can coexist. We are allowed to critique, we'll say, both sides of a story. That's okay. And then I think it was the last article that I sent, is talking about this horseshoe theory, which is, it discusses the horseshoe theory of politics, where I'll pull up my board in a bit, but if you've ever seen a horseshoe, it's like a U shape. And so it essentially points to the fact that the far ends of political spectrums are more alike than they are different, and they bend towards each other like a horseshoe. And it's this theory that's used to explain why the far right and the far left converged in the early parts of this year and last year, more specifically, the Ukraine crisis and their opposition to giving funds to Ukraine, and why you can see now in the Conservative Party, there's two factions in their stance towards whether America should continue funding Ukraine or not. And it was the same when the war began. And so the article suggests that this alignment is less about those on the far left and the far right agreeing ideologically, but more about their opposition to US political establishments or the swamp, the mainstream media narratives. So they both oppose and reject, mainstream media, the establishment, and that's where you see populism sprouting its head. It comes from this position. So you get populists on the far left, and you get your populists coming out of the far right, hence Donald Trump. And to sum it all up, the author's main argument in that last article is that it's this anti-establishment sentiment that's led to a gross oversimplification of really complex international issues. And I think that that's what you can see prevalent in most narratives that you see today. And we'll go into that and how it's affecting current political events, is that when you oversimplify complex international issues, you end up siding on really dangerous territory, if I can put it that way. So that's just a summary of each of those articles to reaffirm the points that we were making last week, before getting into what we're hoping to cover this week. So if you have the time, read them. If you don't, then take my summary as gospel. But I'd encourage you to read them. Richard, you've got your hand up.
Well, it was Curtis's. I would appreciate having a copy of those if you can find the time to get me copies, or
Yes.
or give me the title so I can find the articles.
Yes, we'll do.
Thanks, I'd appreciate that.
No problem. That last one is the one about the horseshoe theory. I sent it some time back and sent it again now, but I think it really hammers the point home. And if there's anything to take away from that, it's with these studies, it's that, because it goes into why, it goes into the how, it goes into the when. It answers all the key questions that one would want to answer when dissecting complex issues: the what, the when, the how, the who, etc. So going into today, this is just, if you want the points that we've covered over the last, 4 studies or so that we've done for Vespers, it's these. First, we started off in the lines and the fractals, and how the increase of knowledge and formalization are 2 waymarks that exist between Panium and the Sunday law. We tried to understand what those waymarks are, and at a very simplified description, the increase of knowledge is where we are learning about something new coming out of a period of darkness, where each little segment in that line we can treat it as coming out of darkness. The line from 1989 all the way up until, we'll say, the Second Advent, there's darkness that runs through that, but intermittently there's light that comes that sheds away darkness to some degree about a specific topic. And then formalization is not a new message, it's the development of what was learned in that increase of knowledge. And that's a key point, is that it's not something new, it's just being built up from what was there. It's kind of like the nail in the term is nail in the coffin, but it kind of puts everything together. It formalizes what was being taught in the increase of knowledge. And so from there, we discussed the move that we've made in our worldview from right-wing ideologies to left-wing ideologies, discussing what it means to be right-wing and what it means to be left-wing, in terms of what's prioritized, freedom or equality, knowing that both are essential and both are needed in a person's existence, in a person's belief about themselves or society, but it's what takes precedence between the two. And from there, you can start delving into what it means to be a libertarian, and this purest emphasis on freedom being the golden calf that stamps upon everything else. And from that, we ended up in last week's lesson about the far left and their multipolar worldview, and the dangers that can lead to. So going into today, Emma, you said that you read up a bit about neo and paleo conservatism. So your and anyone's participation would be welcome. So in one of those articles by Coda Story, that character that we've mentioned time and time again, Max Blumenthal, he condemns this news site Coda Story because Coda Story is investigating, you know, these false claims made by the far left, investigating the denial and support of authoritarian regimes by people who, some factions of the far left like Max, and they ask him for a comment and he refuses to comment. But he says, okay, you want me to give my opinion on this issue that they're discussing about Uyghur oppression, about support of authoritarian regimes. And he gives a final quote where he calls Coda Story and those like Coda Story and accuses them, in inverted commas, of being, in his words, NATO neocon propaganda shops. So it's a
Dura ndafambira nepochi. Ndoza mapa mandifunira muchitidoro raitere ndikati ansandatenga. Ndochinja ndandafambira saka zvese zvabva zvandikosta kusvika mari yapera ndasara nemasensi mashoma. Kana yangu handinombotenga.
Carry on. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And so you see this of those on the far left, of their biggest gripe is neoconservatives. Because remember when we spoke about the far left and their multipolar worldview, it was their resistance to the United States and Western empire building. So we want to take a look at what it means to be a neocon and what it means to be a paleocon. These two brands of conservatism. The far left is consistently attacking neoconservatives. So we have conservatism, and we say there's two factions or two flavors, if you want to call it. So at its core, at its basis, at its foundation, it's conservatism as we understand it. But from that sprouts two similar but contrasted ideologies. Remember that when we compare and contrast, there will be similarities, but there'll also be contrasts. And the contrasts are mostly seen in foreign policy. But we'll get into that when we discuss what neoconservatives are. Neoconservatives and paleo. I'm just going to put paleocons for short. So if I can ask Richard, I don't know, when you hear the word paleo, specifically that prefix paleo, what comes to mind? What do you think of? What does that mean? So when you read paleo, what is that? Or when you read the prefix neo?
I know there was a definition that Elder Tess gave. I've just Googled it. And it's just, but they're not always correct when they come up. But Wikipedia says paleoconservatism is a political philosophy and strain of conservatism in the United States, stressing American nationalism, Christian ethics, regionalism, traditionalist, conservatism, and opposition to Israel. But none of those seem to be the definition that Elder Tess gave when she did her presentation on paleo-conservative.
Yeah, so the definition that you've given is fine. I wasn't asking for Elder Tess's definition. I was asking what you understand by it. So that's fine. And so when you read that, Richard, and I asked the prefix paleo in specific, so you said you used the word brand or something of conservatism. So you're saying it's a type of conservatism. And so what type? Paleo meaning what? If anyone wants to jump in there and tell us what paleo means. Okay, go on, Richard.
I think you have the older ones that is isolationists, and then the younger ones.
Just asking what paleo means.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out which way round it is. But I'll let someone else jump in because I can't remember. It was this must be the younger lot, the more active ones.
Okay, so I heard two words in there, young and old. So now we want to figure out where each one of those belongs. Does anyone want to jump in? Old meaning what and new meaning what?
I'm not sure what you're trying to find out. You're talking about paleo or the old conservatives?
Yeah, so I'm just asking. Charity put in the group, which you said, Natalie. Paleo just meaning old. So old conservatives. And Richard, you are on this track, and neo meaning new. So the way that I remember it is neo sounds like new. They both start with N. Is that you have your new conservatives and you have your old conservatives. And so when trying to understand what these two things are, this neo-conservatives or new conservatism versus old conservatism, Richard, when you gave your definition, you brought up this claim to historic authenticity, and it's their paleocon claim to being the authentic conservatives in contrast to these new kids on the block. You kind of inferred that in what you were saying. They are the classic ones, the old ones, if you want to say taking conservatism back to the old parts. And so it's this, if you want to look at America's positions in after World War I and after World War II, and whether America should join the League of Nations, it was this branch of conservatism that influenced the US not to join the League of Nations. It was this branch of conservatism that wanted to reduce immigration and that wants to reduce immigration with the passage of, in 1924, there was the passage of an Immigration Act. So anti-immigration, not wanting to be part of the League of Nations, and they opposed Franklin Roosevelt as president. I can't remember, Natalie, there's a president that you love. Was it, when I was writing my notes, was it him?
No, it was...
It was who, sorry?
Why has it gone out of my mind? His wife just died recently, Rosalind.
Carter.
Carter, that's it.
Okay.
Carter.
Okay. The reason that came up, because I wanted to ask, why do we think paleo-conservatives oppose Franklin Roosevelt? What did Franklin Roosevelt do for America, if anyone knows? What was his FDR? What was his claim to fame? So if you remember that after World War II, FDR comes in and revitalized the economy in a big way. And the way that he did that was through big government. And so their opposition to FDR in a very, if I want to give you a one-line statement, is because FDR was the brand of big government that revitalized America. And so that kind of gives you a hint as to what your paleocons stand for and what they stand against. So there's three things that I want to list down. League of Nations. Why would they be against the League of Nations or joining the League of Nations? What was the League of Nations, and what is the League of Nations equivalent today? So yeah, exactly. Charity wrote in the chat, I've just seen it now, the New Deal. The FDR brought in the New Deal, which was this idea of a big government coming in to revitalize the economy by, we'll say, giving out more money than conservatives or your paleocons would have wanted. That's a very simple definition, but you can read more about that in your own time. So that's with regards to big government. Why would paleocons, your original authentic conservatives, be opposed to joining the League of Nations? Debbie?
Yeah, was the League of Nations the same as the UN? And I think it was set up, wasn't it? Because obviously because of the world wars, and they wanted to bring peace with all the countries. I think that's generally what they wanted to do, and make sure it didn't happen again.
So the League of Nations comes into being after World War I, and its equivalent is, what was it, World War I or World War II? I think it was World War I. Wanting to bring in peace to ensure that a world war doesn't happen again. And they come in and they say, all you states or you nations, you countries, sign up so that we can have regulations, and we can sign up to a charter that says how we'll address conflict in the future, and we'll collaborate together. And your equivalent today is the UN, or in Europe, it's your EU, or as security nations, it's your NATO. So that kind of rings bells, that should ring bells in your head as to the similarities between that and Donald Trump and wanting to pull out of all these agreements, wanting to pull out of NATO, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's just big government at a global level, wanting to be part of different entities. In the USA, it was the South not wanting to be part of a federation. It's all just regurgitations of the same thought processes. So that, immigration, their positions on immigration, and I'm just going to put FDR and the New Deal. Yeah.
I was just thinking, you're saying the paleocons didn't like really the League of Nations. They're not that hot on the United Nations either, the way it stands, because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They want it to change because they want to get away with what they want to get away with regards to war, especially the violence and rape towards women. That's my opinion, anyway. So I find it no coincidence that they're a little bit, the League of Nations and the United Nations, there's a little bit of conflict here with paleocons.
So as Debbie said, there's similarities between neocons and paleocons, which is both of them are firm in their traditional values, but the differences are, as we'll get in, how they view getting involved in other people's business. And so your UN will reflect your League of Nations today. The UN was a development after World War II. They saw that the League of Nations wasn't built to achieve what they wanted to achieve because World War II happened. And so the United Nations comes into being after World War II in a better, more strong, committed way. So those are your paleocons. Your neocons now, what's their main concern? So the main concern for paleocons, or the main concerns, is immigration, big government, and not wanting to be part of or held accountable as part of a unified collection of nations. Now, your neocons, both conservatives, what's their big concern? What do they want to prevent? Emma?
I'm not sure. I think they're very similar. I don't think they like immigration either, do they?
So there are similarities, but there's also contrasts.
I think the difference, as you said, you alluded to earlier, was foreign policy. I think are they isolationist compared to intervention?
Remember that your paleocons are saying, let's not get involved with these big countries, these other countries. Let's oppose big government. Let's reduce immigration, which both parties, both strands will, but in different ways. So your neocons, their main concern is wanting to prevent the development of a new arrival. So they see America as the #1 superpower, and they don't want China or Russia coming to take that #1 rival spot. Natalie, I saw your hand go up.
Is that like this paleo see neocons as imperialists? Yeah.
Yes. So your neocons will be your imperialists. The idea of building an American power around the world. Richard's put in the chat unilateralism. So this is where this idea of unilateralism kind of coalesces and sees its face, is that America, #1, and down with everyone else. So I'm just going to put here development of rival to the US position. And so this, yes, Natalie?
Sorry, hand up. Can you just answer my question, because I forgot? Was Reagan a neocon?
Ronald Reagan was a paleocon.
Okay, because I just saw an article today or yesterday, I can't remember, saying the percentages on research, they all want to get back to Reagan. So paleocon, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Exactly. And so it's, we'll see why that happened. And there's an article that ties the movement of the Conservative Party from this paleocon worldview, losing its influence around the 70s to the 2000s, early 2000s, and then gaining its resurgence to what led to the development of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is like the culmination of paleocon thinking over the last 10 decades as a fight against neocons and their resurgence or their development in the early 2000s. Yeah, Natalie?
It makes me mention that I like.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
You mentioned the president before that I like. His name keeps going out of my mind. Debbie, who was it?
Carter.
Jimmy Carter. If you remember Jimmy Carter, they wanted to get rid of Jimmy Carter, the paleocons, and bring in Reagan. And it was all to do with foreign policy as well. And also, if you want to look at the other stuff, it was to do with abortion, same-sex marriage and all that stuff. But if we're talking about foreign policy here, it was definitely get rid of Jimmy Carter, bring in Reagan.
Yeah. And so we're going to touch on specifically foreign policy and what that means. But as we start looking at foreign policy, it's this neoconservatism that grew in popularity, as I said a few moments ago, between the 70s and the early 2000s. And it kind of peaked in around about the Iraq War. It's that philosophy that led to George Bush buying into the idea of invading Iraq, and it's used as a slur really by people on the far left to describe neocons as war hawks that, and you brought it up, Natalie, that support aggressive militarianism, or your neo-imperialism, your new empire building, your new colonialism. So it's neocons that are the problem for people on the far left, because it's neocons that want to expand their empire to prevent the development of a new rival. To people on the far left, it is not paleocons that are the concern. Yes, conservatives as a whole are problematic for the left in general, but it's neocons that are the bane of their existence, because to them, apartheid, colonialism are the problems. They are problems, but the danger of seeing them as the only and underlying problem to society is that it ends up downplaying other issues, and you can end up, as we saw last week, siding with authoritarian regimes on key issues for different reasons, but end up siding with them. So this fight between isolationists and interventionists is a fight within the Conservative Party. Your isolationists are your paleocons, because for them, immigration is a big thing. For neocons, it is big, just not wanting immigration and immigrants is just a conservative issue. But it's more prominent and more pronounced within your paleocon branch. Isolationists wanting to a strong idea on restricting immigration, decentralizing the government. So when we talk about decentralization, what does that mean? Think about your 1850 history and your presidents and their arguments made about where the capital should reside, what should the federal government look like. Decentralization is essentially the idea that there doesn't need to be a centralized power that tells everyone what to do. There doesn't need to be, when we look at what's happened mid this year with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, or the precedent set by Roe v. Wade, it was essentially saying, no, there doesn't need to be a centralized stance on this issue. We can let states decide for themselves. That's what centralization is. It's having a central unit that decides everything for everyone else, whereas decentralization is putting the power in everyone else's hands, saying you can decide for yourself. And so they're really big on decentralization. And you hear this in areas like cryptocurrency, and wanting to spread financial assets away from centralized banks to a decentralized platform. So it's the same process. Take power away from something central, the swamp or your mainstream government, and into the hands of ordinary people. That's why populists are so popular, because it appeals to this idea of this is an outdated term, but I'm going to use it to make the point, stick it to the man, because it's this the old guard that are your centralized powers. And so in their minds, it's the idea of giving power back into the hands of ordinary people. But the dangers of that is that it goes unregulated. And so paleocons, as we're talking about paleocons, and why we need to see that as how awful it is because of the restrictions on immigration, their love for decentralization, the idea of protectionism, so wanting to protect American greatness within its own borders, economic nationalism, isolationism, not getting involved in other people's business. So that's that isolationist mentality. And traditional conservative ideals find sway on both sides, relating to gender, culture, society, etc. Both oppose abortion and gay marriage and LGBTQ rights, but one is more emphasized within paleocon branch than it is within your neocons. You typically find your neocons in your more centrist conservative party. So there's a Republican that's coming to mind. Your John McCain's, there's another one now who's currently a senator. Romney's, your Mitt Romney's, those will be your neocons. They're more centrist than your far-right paleocons. In one of the articles that I had sent, there's a statement that I picked up, which I want you to listen to it and see how it resonates with what we see when we look at culture. So the statement is, conservatives question the supposition or the idea that European culture and wars can ever be transplanted. So they question this idea that European culture or American wars or European wars can ever be taken from the borders of America or Europe and put into or forced upon non-Western cultures due to separate cultural heritages. So the thought is that South Americans or Southeast Asians or Africans or whatever culture there is around the world, there can never be a mix. We shouldn't even try to impose our culture on them because they're different cultural heritages. So let's not even bother getting involved. That's your paleo-conservative mindset. And Natalie sent an article that Elder Tess had shared. She shared it on the Bible Study Forum, if you're all on there, this morning or yesterday, can't remember, about I can't remember his name, but he used to head up a prominent position in the Human Rights Committee, and this idea of the West not getting involved in other people's cultures because of not wanting the West to impose their cultural beliefs on other cultures. So you get that from people on the left saying, leave those cultures to their own. It's their cultures. How they relate to gender is part of their culture. But paleo-conservatives question the same thing from a different basis. And so this is all coming to how those on the far left and those on the far right get to the same point, but from totally different perspectives. If you were to ask what the primary or the greatest threat to paleo-cons or paleo-conservatism is, it's feminism, because it destroys the family unit as we understand it. There's a prominent paleo-con, recently left Fox News, Tucker Carlson. I'm sure you're all aware of him. And I want us to keep him in mind as a paleo-con, because it will come evident as to where the far left are getting it wrong today when we start discussing current global issues and Tucker Carlson and his perspective and Putin's perspective about current geopolitics. But during the invasion of Ukraine, your Tucker Carlson had the perspective to leave Putin alone and America should just mind their own business. So when we spoke about neoconservatives, we spoke about this idea of neoconservatives not wanting a rival. America at the top, and so there should be no rival. Tucker Carlson looks at Putin, looks at Russia, and says, just leave Putin to do what Putin is doing, and America should just mind their own business. So he's not necessarily in favor of America over Russia or wanting to back Russia in their toppling of America as a spy for Russia, just wants America to mind their own business. And this is that isolationist worldview. There's an article which I brought up at the beginning of today's study, which is by Vox, which is called Paleo-Conservatism, the movement that explains Donald Trump, which traces the history of paleocons. Let me just share my screen for a second. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so this article, which I'd encourage you to read, because it points out the dangers with the far right and how it's the far right that will bring in the Sunday law, essentially. Your paleocons, it traces the movement from a history and how we got to where we are. If you remember Pat Buchanan, when we spoke about the moral majority and the resurgence of the moral majority between 1979 and 1989, Pat Buchanan was one of those key figures. It's your paleocons that are in that sphere of politics. And then it speaks about this love for Donald Trump amongst paleocons. And so remember when I said that it's typically your neocons that end up being your moderate. Today, there's no such thing as a moderate conservative because they've just swung so far to the right, but it's your moderate conservatives that are your neocons. So at a very, now, how do I, at a summarized and distilled level, if we were to ask what is your difference between your neocons and your paleocons, it's I think Emma and a few of you mentioned it at the beginning, this isolationist or interventionist approach to foreign policy. Does America get involved in the fight in other nations, or does it mind its own business and use its troops to defend its borders within America against immigration? So I argued at the beginning that neocons and paleocons are against immigration, but how much is that emphasized? Where should America's funding or money be spent? Should it be spent on arming Ukrainians against Putin, or should it be spent on getting more soldiers or more of the army along the southern border with Mexico? Should it be spent arming law enforcement within America? Should it be spent putting more guns in soldiers' hands to protect schools against school shootings? An oxymoron, but it's this interventionist or non-interventionist approach. So that's your far right and conservatism. So when we look at your, we'll say the left, we'll just call it the left for now. And if we're going to compare and contrast conservatism or liberalism, let me put liberalism as a fair compare and contrast. And we're going to contrast and compare that with liberalism. And we said that at a basis, conservatism is just conservatism, but you have two brands or two flavors of conservatism, your paleocons and your neocons. And we look at the left, it's reasonable and appropriate and just to, without proving it, just from a chiastic structure or compare and contrast as we juxtapose conservatism with liberalism, that liberalism will also have two schools of thought. I'm not going to call them neo-liberals and paleo-liberals because neoliberalism kind of means something different, but there's also two schools of thought. That's all I'm going to put. And so if your far left agree from different positions with your far right, and we said that in the center you have your neocons, would it surprise us that your more moderate Democrats, those not on the far left, are going to agree over certain issues with your neocons? And when I say agree, remember on the far left and your paleocons, they don't agree because of the same reasons. The reasons that paleocons are side with Russia is different to the reasons that those on the far left side with Russia. So your neocons are going to have similarities or end up at the same place with your centrist Democrats, but for different reasons. And it's those different reasons that we can start beginning to wrap up with next week. There is the article, which I'm sure we all have read multiple times over in trying to make sense of today, which I don't know. Do people want to start reading that article now, or please read it during the week? Or do you want to close? I guess that's my question. Do you want to close now, or do you want to spend a bit of time reading the article, singling out Israel, a perspective from the left?
I'd have a little bit of that, but that's up to everyone else.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep reading. I don't know if people are happy to
so it gives us a little bit of a head start next week at sticking on brains.
Yeah, I agree.
So I just want to, does that make sense? Does what we've gone through make sense so far?
Yep.
Can I just clarify it?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I think I find this topic, I don't know, I find this topic quite challenging. I think, so with the neocons and the paleocons, when you put there the League of Nations and you put, so they're isolationists, the paleocons, they're saying, we're going to protect America, we should stay out of other people's business, we're just going to stay home and look after ourselves and spend money on policing our borders and not sending people abroad. And then the neocons are interventionists, so they want to intervene in other countries because they want to keep America on top. Now, is that fair to say? So don't paleos want to do the same thing because they're isolationists, because they're saying we're staying over here because we don't get contaminated by you lot and we don't want to spend our money on you lot. And the neocons are saying we only want to go to war with you and bully you because we want to stay on top. And so it's the same kind of coming from the same angle, and that's why they're both conservative.
Yeah, so they both view American essentialism as great. It's wanting to preserve America's greatness, but for different reasons and through different means. So America's greatness is, as you said, let's not get contaminated by the rest of the world because they're not great. It's not make the world great again. It's make America great again. And so how we're going to do that? We're going to reduce immigration. We're going to have more babies because more babies means more people to make America great. And we can continue and propagate this idea of American essentialism. Whereas your neocons, as you've succinctly put it, is saying, let's spread this American greatness to the rest of the world. We're not going to get contaminated when we go outside our borders. What we're going to do is we're going to export this American brand through capitalism. And that was the fear with the Soviet Union. It's that America is bringing American capitalism into the Soviet Union. And it's through what may seem like small things, McDonald's opening up, through Toyota opening up, through Ford cars being used in the Soviet Union. It's that exportation of the American brand into the Soviet Union that Russia hated neocons for. It's why Putin hated Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton was going to get involved in the issues that Russia gets involved in. It's why Putin will say loved or wanted Donald Trump in office, because he knew that when I invade Ukraine, Trump is not going to do a lot. Sure, there was a bit of criticism coming from the Conservative Party, but not to the degree that it would have come from a person like Hillary Clinton, or even George Bush for that matter. So both conservatives, both believe in traditional family values, but it's what do we do with America? Do we export America, or do we keep America for ourselves? At a basic level.
Okay, and you just brought Hillary Clinton into it. Presumably that was your other diagram just now, which says that the Democrats in Central are close to the neoconservatives in their ideals of their behavior.
Yeah. So if you have your, I'll say, far centrist, and I know I'm drawing them on the right, but and your far left. In fact, let's do this to make it.
But then that makes more of a horseshoe when you do it like that. If you draw the horseshoe down that side and that side.
That's why I said, let me do this. gonna look okay. 2 seconds. I'm just
I'm worried.
So these are those, I just switched it from left to right wing. And if you can see this being your horseshoe, it's these two, your paleocons and your far left, that agree on certain issues for different reasons, and your centrists and your neocons who end up agreeing over certain things, not agreeing for the same reason. And I think I keep saying this over and over and over and over and over again, because it's this that I'm worried that when I make the final point that I want to make, people will think that, you know, people like Biden agreeing with neocons makes Biden a conservative. It does not. It's just pointing out that there is this chiasm that you see. Different reasons, but ending up at the same position. Or Hillary Clinton as an interventionist. George Bush was an interventionist. Hillary Clinton was an interventionist. But they're interventionists for different reasons. Does the diagram make a bit more sense now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it a bit like libertarians and the freedom situation and the right wingers freedom, because of them as well with regards to liberty, free speech and stuff.
What do you mean by that? What are you saying? Is that
Don't worry.
what? Okay.
You know, you're saying they agree on some things, but they come in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So like libertarians agree on ultimate freedom, and the right wings believe in ultimate freedom, First Amendment and all that. But they come in at it at different ways because they believe in different things, don't they? The
Mm-hmm.
far right and libertarian.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah. If that can be explained in that way. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any questions before we get into? We can read for about 15 minutes before closing.
I was going to ask with regards to Neos. I know that Trump because he's an for me, insulationist. He doesn't want infected.
Sorry, I can't hear you too well, Natalie.
The way of life. Sorry, they don't want Putin doesn't want the way of life change. They don't want to be infected by the way of life of the USA. So with a neocon that could happen, where with an isolationist it doesn't happen because they're so isolationist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So yeah, Putin's fear is that the Soviet way of life would be influenced, and the paleocon fear is that the rest of the world will have an imprint, or you socialists in Europe will bring your cultural imprint onto American soil. Richard has said in the chat, Kissinger, not sure who that is. You can tell me in a few seconds, did a short interview saying America's ruined as they let many people of different cultures into the country. Do you want to elaborate? Who's Kissinger? I don't know who that is.
He's a very old guy. Kissinger, his name
Kissinger.
is.
Okay.
Kissinger, yeah. I just seen a little clip of him. Someone was doing an interview with him, and he just said how America's been spoiled because of America's let too many people in of different cultures. But years ago, only those who got caught up with all, a certain loads of rubbish would have heard of Kissinger. Yeah, it's one of the so-called wealthy people that just run things, but it's more complicated than that. Much more complicated. Because you've got that strategy that tries to unite the libertarians with the paleo-conservative, paleo-libertarianism as well. There's that Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell, you know, from the end of the Cold War, to try to bring those mindsets together. But not everyone would have heard of that person, but a few people will have. Kissinger.
And what you spoke about is essentially what led to the creation of the alt-right. It's this marriage between libertarianism and your paleocons. So that's what's led to this resurgence in the alt-right in 2014, 2012, and all the years leading up to today. So that's where the Sunday Law comes from. That is not downplaying, you know, what neocons did in Iraq, and etc. I'll come to you, Emma. I just want to read what Charity wrote after Richard's message, because that's kind of what we were saying, is that so they both believe, so your neocons and your paleocons, in American exceptionalism, but the focus for each group differs. So they both have this basis that America is the glorious land, and but the basis for that and their focus of achieving that and the focus of what to do with that greatness is different. Where one looks more inwards, your paleocons, and the other takes that to the rest of the world through evangelism. I like that point. Through exporting their message or their brand. That would be your neocons. Emma, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Henry Kissinger, quite influential in American politics. And I had heard his name, but I didn't know much about him. I heard it on the radio and I was just trying to remember what they said, but it was very significant. And Natalie's put, he was Secretary of State. He shaped foreign policy under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford in that kind of era. And he died at 100 this week. So and even up to then, up until about the last few years, he was a major voice in American politics. So even though he wasn't even working anymore, so he did. And I just opened an article in The Guardian, who's basically saying, the first line says that he was a strategist, a Secretary of State under 12 American presidents. So he had a huge career. He may have overseen the 20th century, but the champion of US power was also a symbol of its dangerous neo-imperialism. So I think he was quite far right in his politics, but
yeah,
and quite dangerous when it comes to immigration and other things. But I wanted to read more about him, so he was quite a significant character.
Yeah. Would you mind posting a link to that article in the chat?
Yeah, sure, I'll do
that. Okay, so let us just begin reading this article very briefly. We definitely won't finish it today. Can you let me know if you can see my screen and what screen you can see?
Yeah, I can see. Just make it a bit bigger. Thanks.
Okay.
Singling out Israel, yeah, I can see that.
Okay. So yeah, this is an article that Alder Tess shared a while ago, mid last year, called "Singling Out America: Perspective from the Left." From the left, about the left.
Singling out Israel, you said America.
Sorry, thank you. Singling out Israel, and how this struggle for Palestine gained such prominence. The answer might tell us something about broader patterns in left-wing politics today. I'll start off and then I'll ask some of you to chip in reading. The left is frequently accused of singling Israel out for censure. All of the authoritarian and oppressive countries in the world, so the argument goes, left-wing thinkers and activists disproportionately target the Middle East only democracy. This is often just a rhetorical ploy, a propaganda device used to imply that Israel's critiques are biased or worse, prejudiced. However, it also happens to be true. States everywhere behave in a manner comparable to Israel: occupation, ethnic nationalism, exclusion, racism. These are systemic issues, products of the modern nation-state system we live in, and not the unique characteristics of any particular country or nationalist ideology. Yet Israel and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination occupies a position within the left's political imagination that is incommensurate with its relative size or importance in the international struggle for justice. Israel's crimes, and they are crimes, let us not forget that. What Israel is doing, has done, are crimes. It is abhorrent. But what's going on with Israel against the Palestinians, it elicits a moral outrage that comparable acts of brutality in other countries, like in India in Kashmir, in Russia with Chechnya, this was written in 2015, in Chechnya, to raise a few examples, do not. This is often dismissed as mere whataboutery, or simply buying into one of Israel's favored propaganda tropes. But the question of how the struggle for Palestine, an unquestionably just cause. So the fight for Palestinian statehood is a just cause. It's necessary in what they are striving for. Let's not forget that. But it's gained a prominence on the left that needs to be addressed seriously. And the answer can also perhaps tell us something about broader patterns of thought in left-wing politics today. So this introduction is essentially pointing out that there are critiques leveled against Israel, which are fair critiques about how they have dealt with Palestinian statehood rights, dealt with Palestinians, their racist, ethnic cleansing narrative. These are all just. But it's disproportionate when you consider other nations doing the same thing and them not being censured in the same way that Israel has been and is being censured. And so two thoughts that come out from this introduction is one, the Palestinian fight is a just fight and it's a just cause for statehood, the struggle for Palestinian statehood. But two, the censure that Israel gets for how they behave is disproportionate to their, we'll say, role in the world or their size in global affairs. Like if we were to think of India or Russia as bigger nations on the world stage or China who commit similar or if not worse acts of atrocity, they don't receive as much censure as do Israel. That's all that this opening paragraph is saying. And so we want to understand why and understand, is this singling out, is it anti-Semitic? Is it coming from a different place? And so the question is asked, is this just a new breed of anti-Semitism? And so we'll read this. Yeah, Natalie?
Who's singling them out?
So the article is saying it's people on, we'll say the far left, but there's people on the left who criticize Israel.
Okay, because I was going to say that it's more so the far left, because if you think of Sanders, sorry. It's not so much the far left, because if you think of Sanders, he's pro-Israel, isn't he? Do everything for Israel.
Remember that when dealing with, when considering Bernie Sanders on the issue of Palestinian statehood and Israel rights, that Bernie Sanders is Jewish. So it's his view in this matter is not representative of the far left.
Fair enough, but it is people.
He has a foot in the fight.
I get what you mean, but his party, they are all for pro-Israel, aren't they?
Yes. No.
No?
Your far left are very vehemently pro-Palestine. If you were to look up AOC and that branch of the left, they are.
Is that? Would you say AOC is definitely still far left, or would you say she's moderate?
we'll discuss that further in the article.
All right.
But yeah. So those are the points in the introduction. So we want to ask, okay, why are, I'm going to say the far left. So in our minds, we can think of it as the far left. Try not to attach Bernie Sanders to this camp because it's a bit more complicated with him. As I said, as a Jewish national, we'll say he's got a foot in the fight. Yeah, if you want to think far left and this article addressing the far left, remembering that in what we were going through, the ideology of the far left seeps into mainstream left thinking. And it's that what we have to be cautious of. Do I have a reader? Just to read this and then we can start wrapping up. Yeah.
This is 2015 article, isn't it? So
yeah.
But it will, I haven't read it, but it will actually benefit us all for today as well with the war in Gaza, in Palestine, Gaza and Jerusalem. Yeah.
Are you talking about this article? Or...
This article was from 2015, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you think about what's going on today in Palestine, in Gaza, would it be helpful to see the fight and who's on what side and stuff as well today?
I don't want to get into who's right or who's wrong, because as I stated in the study that we're doing today, when you start looking,
I mean, like who's on what side, who, like,
yeah,
that's what I meant for today, because this is 2015, which was very relevant then, but it's also very relevant, I think, for what's going on today to see who's on what side.
Yeah, if we just at a basic level remember that what's happening today is not new it's just a manifestation of all the different episodes that have happened between Israel and, we'll say, Hamas specifically. So it's part of that story. Can I just get someone to read this paragraph and then we'll close for today?
Yeah, I can read. For some, the reason is obvious: anti-Semitism. In his response to the Diversiture campaign on U.S. campuses against Israel, the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman wrote, singling out Israel for opprobrium and international sanction, out of all proportion to any other party in the Middle East, is anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. This argument is often dismissed as ideologically motivated special pleading, and sometimes it is. But we should be careful on this score. The left is not immune from prejudice, and historically, anti-Semitism has found a home at both ends of the political spectrum. As an explanation for the left's disproportionate focus on Israel and the Palestinians, it is, however, unconvincing. True, anti-Semitism sometimes creeps into anti-Zionist discourse, but the notion that the left has become anti-Semitic en masse is frankly absurd. If you doubt this, then ask yourself the following. Given the history of Israel-Palestine, see below, would attitudes on the left be any different if Israel was a Christian country of European origin? I suspect not.
So the author is questioning this idea if the left's opposition to Israel is coming from an anti-Semitic perspective. And the author is essentially saying, okay, maybe, but that's too simple. You know, it's too simple to see it as an anti-Semitic problem. Anti-Semitism has found, a home in the left and the right, but as a way to kind of gauge if it is an anti-Semitic problem is replace Israel with a European English country that's doing what they're doing to Palestine. Would their outrage be the same? It would be. It wouldn't be any different. And so from his perspective, it's not anti-Semitism. That's the reason that the far left are so anti-Israel. So what is the reason? And we'll explore that next week in Vespers. And then for the study on Sabbath, I'll wrap up this whole series with, in a very long way, to the point that I want to make. But thank you everyone for your participation. I hope today's made sense.
Sorry, on the forum, yeah.
Yes, I will post it. Does anyone have any questions or any statements or contributions before we close? I wanted to point out while we were discussing, but I never managed to, is when we were discussing about, you know, the move from the right to the left, and this what the solutions are in terms of who brings the solutions on the left. I just wanted to note that when we started discussing feminism and we explored, you know, what feminism is, and then toyed with the idea of cultural feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism, and seeing that feminism is really radical feminism. This shift to the left and this starting to critique the left happened in the context of, or around the same time as, the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. And the dates for that were, if I got these correct, it ran from the 11th of April to the 1st of June. And while that case was going on, what was the startling or key thing that we noticed, or we saw, is that there was a lot actually on the left and so-called feminists who supported Johnny Depp. And so in the same way, when we look at feminism and how under the banner of feminism, you have groups of people who you would think would be on the right side of history side with those on the wrong side of history, who will say on the far right. With foreign policy, you have the same thing, or in general critique of the left. So when we talk about our transition from Trumpers to Clintonists, if I can call it that, we have to, in the same way, understand what makes a feminist. We have to understand why do we side with Hillary Clinton in 2016? What about her foreign policy positions, or her America positions, internal America positions, make sense for us? And why does she have those positions, and why do we need to have these positions? So I know that now we've spoken about foreign policy a lot, but it now comes into how we deal with internal policy as a movement, internal policy as in our own nations, and etc. It's not just a foreign policy. Foreign policy is just like the thing, the way you can see it most evidently or most clearly, but it all circles back to, one, identifying what the root problem in society is. This bastion of, or this parading of culture beyond all else. It's culture where we see the problem lies. And two, what do we do with big government or small government? How do we look to leadership or hierarchies? And remember, there was a study that I did about capitalism, and we spoke about communism and the far left, and this utopian idea that we can get to a place on the far, this is coming from the far left, we can get to a place where we don't need government. Everyone can self-regulate. That's the exact same thought that we see at the libertarian end of the scale. So it's this horseshoe yet again. In different areas, you see this horseshoe. And so this is us just seeing it in a different place, foreign policy. And the problems that you get into are that equality ends up being the victim at the end of the day. So it's, how do we achieve equality? That's what we're trying to answer. How do we achieve equality?
Does it look like?
Yeah, what does it look like? Does equality really this is going to sound funny, but is equality really we are all equal? Of course we are. But does that mean that hierarchies get thrown away?
Nope.
Yeah, no. But thank you for your participation today. As I said, we'll wrap
Sorry,
this up.
Richard wrote a question in the chat.
Oh,
I don't know
yeah,
if you want, if it's open up another can of worms, but no, I'm only a different. Well,
what is our role amongst these political ideologies? I won't give justice to that answer now. I'll, in a brief sentence, try to. But we started off by trying to explore what it means to be left-wing and what it means to be right-wing. And when we see that equality over freedom sits on the left wing, that means that equality is prioritized over freedom. So at a basic level, if you can look at the United States and say, America is wanting to be the banner child of freedom, American freedom, as paleo-conservatives, the light shining on a hill for the rest of the world to see. We're not going to export that. We want to be unique in our American greatness, because make America great. That's freedom. Libertarians, your far right, it's freedom. So what takes precedent? Is it Americans' freedoms at the expense of equality, or is it equality at the expense of freedoms? So to answer your question, what is our role amongst these political ideologies? It's really answering the question, what do we prioritize? Your freedom as a person, or you as an individual in the movement in maintaining equality? It's your freedoms take a back seat when it comes face to face with equality. And we're talking about the value of a soul, the value of a human being, and what that equality does look like. I guess that's what we're beginning to explore. And I know I said I won't give the answer justice. I will try to next week. But when we looked at that horseshoe, we can clearly see we're not on the far right. Your paleocons, and we can clearly see the dangers of being on the far left. So where do we most align? It's around, that Hillary Clinton ideology. That's my perspective, at least.
President.
But what I want to get is why. It's not just that we support Hillary Clinton or should have supported Hillary Clinton. It's why. Is it just because, this is going to sound crass, but is it just because she's a woman and that she would have been a woman president? What if Nikki Haley, who's running for president now, what if she was running in 2016? Would we wanted her to be president? It's more than that. It's Nikki Haley being the Republican nominee. Well, not nominee, sorry. She's running for president in the Republican Party, running to become the Republican nominee in the Republican Party. Would we support her? No, because her ideology doesn't align with what our ideology is. But we see that most evident in Hillary Clinton, and that's why she should have won. Hope that kind of answered your question.
Yep.
Yep, that was great. Thanks.
No problem. So let us close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the study that we've had today. Thank you for the opportunity to explore the spectrum of politics, if I can call it that, from the far right to the far left, or the far left to the far right, and everything in between. As we try to position ourselves and find out where we sit, I really do pray that we don't just have as a fact where we sit, but we really understand why we have the beliefs that we do have. That's my goal in these studies, and I pray that you may help me and you may help everyone achieve that goal, so that we may come out of all of this knowing what we believe and why we believe it. I thank you for the participation, and I pray that the Sabbath as a whole may be a blessing to everyone that participates in it, and praise your name always. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.